There she is. You fixed the technical problem. Adele, you missed all my compliments. I called you an authentic and passionate voice on these issues, but I'm just finishing talking about your book, Everyday Transgressions. And I was working in the late 80s and 90s on the farm workers issues in California. And I was just making the point that just as they needed brilliant legal minds to set a legal foundation for their rights, we now have domestic workers that you specialize in, and I've mentioned your international work, who despite all the laws fast-tracking them into citizenship, have a very vulnerable period and are treated very vulnerably. And I've recommended that everybody get your book, Everyday Transgressions. And my friends, you are now over 230 attendees. Congratulations again. I turn you over to the wonderful Professor Adele Blackett, who will introduce Ric Bienstock and his incredible section of this symposium today on the documentary Enslaved. Adele, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beryl Washman, for such a generous introduction. I'm really honored to be here. And it is just such a privilege to join you in this day and to have the opportunity to introduce Ric Bienstock and Kramer Wimberly. Ric Bienstock, award-winning documentary filmmaker, officer of the Order of Canada, for her commitment to raising awareness of global events and conflicts through film, and such a broad range of films that could hardly be of more contemporary significance, bringing for many our history, our collective histories back to us, and a proud Vanier College graduate, as well as a proud McGill University graduate. So I'm just really honored to have met you, and I very much look forward to this conversation with you. And Kramer Wimberly, lead diver with Divers with a Purpose, who figures so centrally in this 6-part documentary series, who over the past 26 years has traveled to 35 countries as a scuba diver, and brings to life with such insight and courage the Enslaved series. He's also a graduate of the City University of New York Law School. So just a rich composite of expertise and experience. So thank you both for joining us here today. And I'm hoping, Ric, that your video and your mic are also going to be turned on so that you can participate fully in this session. So this 6-episode documentary that's being aired on CBC now, we're about midway through, and that is also available on CBC Gem, is at once path-breaking. Great to see you. It's a path-breaking contribution to our knowledge of slavery as a global institution. It's a painfully poignant narrative that combines individual reconnections with lost direct or broader community roots. Samuel L. Jackson features prominently in his story of initiation into Benga culture. His heritage in Gabon for sure is critical, and yet the story creates such rich spaces for the interwoven plurality of stories, including your own, Kramer, and a stunningly beautiful juxtaposition of landscapes and environments across both sides of the Atlantic. From the Gabonese banks, where you reveal stunningly hundreds of acres of oyster shells that represent the last bit of sustenance that enslaved Africans, and you insist on that terminology, Africans who were enslaved, but sustenance that they ate before embarking on the Middle Passage. You move to Suriname, you move to Africatown in Alabama, you move to Ghana, you move to Brazil, where the vast majority of enslaved Africans disembarked, and you take the Black Atlantic so seriously that you constantly return to the sea. And Derek Walcott's poetry just resonates through your work. Implicitly, you comb the seabeds. You comb them like a transatlantic crime scene, and you uncover artifacts that the sea preserved, piecing together so many aspects of this deeply troubled histories that must be told. I cannot thank you enough for this work. I'd like to start our conversation with two affirmations that particularly caught my attention and might provide a fitting place to start this conversation. But first, let me turn, I believe that the starting point is going to be the trailer. Yes, there's going to be an attempt to show what I've tried to capture very briefly. So that 5 minutes, I think, is just going to convey so much better than any words can, the richness of what you've done.
I've always been intrigued by the Atlantic slave trade. We only talk about the ships that made it. We never talk about the ones that didn't. We want to tell those stories. People always talk about slavery like it's ancient history. It's not. This is a larger story of what was really going on with the slave trade.
Wow.
Yes. There are ships that went down with our ancestors on them. We'll use the adventure of diving to tell a larger story.
Look at that. That's a task.
These merchants were trafficking in Africans and ivory.
This is called the Volongo.
We're actually looking at the site of one of the greatest crimes of humanity
In all of history.
The purity of blood legislation led directly to the Pope. It made, for the first time, race a criteria.
The story of the slave trade is world history. England was involved, Portugal was involved, the French, the Dutch, the Africans were involved in it.
We followed our ancestry back to Arthur Bynum.
Arthur was born into slavery.
3 years old when slavery ended. And this is his mother, Matilda.
Who was a slave.
Yes, that's right.
My ancestors came from Gabon. I want to see who I am and where I came from. I was a lost son that returned. I put a link back in my chain that was broken. It touches something inside me.
All of these Europeans thought that it was compatible to conduct this horrific trade. And at the same time, these guys were going into church and saying their prayers every day.
One of those was worth one slave.
This is currency created to buy a human being.
Time and thought was put into how to design this inhumane arrangement.
Yes, this is the era of the Enlightenment. This is scientific.
It's absolutely sinister.
The case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard.
This is just one case that illustrates a huge industry.
Right here, people made deals that affected slavery.
You can't really understand the slave trade unless you think of coffee. It's a center of a business concerned with the slave trade.
Sugar and coffee was the curse of black people because Europeans wanted sugar.
What is it?
This is part of a sugar factory.
So the life expectancy of an African here.
They record 8 to 10 years. That's the price of sugar.
There's more than one way to be connected to who we are. Musically, I know my lineage. The banjo, it was known by everybody as a Black instrument. Are you saying that bluegrass actually began with African Americans?
100%. Fractals are patterns that repeat at different scales. Such a terrific example here. Got the cross within crosses on the roof.
It's beautiful, but it's also mathematical.
Exactly. This is really a geometric theme that occurs again and again in these African structures. I was looking at these aerial photographs of African villages, and that's when I realized those look like fractals. Once you understand fractals, that whole African indigenous knowledge system opens up. It's all over Africa.
People were rising up, people were fighting back.
It couldn't have all transpired in peace.
Africans were not accepting this state of affairs.
The head represents your soul, your being. You can have all the expressions. So in the faces, you can see the identity. It's that I'm trying to capture.
It's fantastic.
The story of emancipation is just wrong if it's told without African Americans actually claiming their own freedom.
Some people say, "Oh, don't you feel sorrow when you see this?" Still a feeling of anger for me.
Yeah.
This is man's inhumanity to man. This is almost like the capital of it.
So powerful. The two affirmations that particularly caught my attention might provide a fitting starting point for this conversation. So Kramer in episode 2 on the rationalization of slavery, from holding an emblem of the pillaging of Africa, courageously excavated from the ocean floor, that African history was not started with the enslavement of Africans. African history was interrupted by it. And then in episode 4, remembering his grandmother born in the 1800s, whose mother was a slave, Samuel Jackson opined that people are always talking about slavery like it was ancient history. It was not, and it lasted for a very long time. And I wonder if you could each speak a bit about the genesis of this remarkable collaboration, your expectations, and what most surprised you, or what was most moving for you on this journey.
Well, I should say, thank you very much, by the way, for all your kind words. And hi, Kramer. Nice to see you again. We keep seeing each other on Zoom. I should say that it was the whole series was really the brainchild of this also Montrealer, Simcha Yakubovich, who had done previous films on other topics that related to diving. And him and another gentleman, Yaron, who he worked with, we're told, there are some slave shipwrecks around the world. This goes back, prior to us starting and it kind of planted a seed that there's a story to tell here that hasn't really been mined very much. One, nobody's done as many dives as we've done in the end, but that there was a story to tell about the transatlantic slave trade as opposed to slavery. There's still lots of stories to tell about slavery, but so it was really they began, and it's really Simcha's vision, and he was the series director across all the episodes and brought me on as producer. We've collaborated a lot, and I directed some location things with Samuel Jackson, but it was really a labor of love for all involved. And even getting Kramer and Diving with a Purpose involved, which is the heart of the series. And Kramer, I said to Kramer, or I don't know if I told you this, but that there's so many things that you said over the course of the series that made it into the film that have become these, like you say, that the slavery, the history didn't begin; it was interrupted, and these are things we're seeing repeated on Twitter. But anyway, I'm babbling a little bit, but all this to say that the idea became to talk about the trade. How could it happen? The business of slavery. What were the motivating factors? How could something The figures were stunning and staggering. And also, I thought I knew a little bit about it. And then, I learned a lot. 2 million lost at sea. 2 million. That's not a few ships going down. So that was the impetus. And then, of course, it takes a long time to put together a whole team. But I just wanted to give credit where credit is due. He had a real vision for trying to tell the scope of this story and the fact that it was a global industry. Kramer, you will likely have insight as well.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Adele, for giving us the platform to be able to communicate Simca's vision and the story that DWP, Diving with a Purpose, has been working on for the past 16 years. I thought I knew a lot about the transatlantic slave trade also. Right? I've studied history for a long time because it's part of my history. And I was always looking for answers to questions that I didn't feel like I was getting answers, right? In a way that made sense to me. So part of my journey was always trying to find answers to questions that didn't make sense, right? Or looking at the answers that I was being provided with that didn't seem full or complete.
Mm-hmm.
So working with Diving with a Purpose was an opportunity to answer some of those questions that I always had. And working with Simca and Ric was an opportunity to have some of those answers and questions, because there's still a host of questions that haven't been asked, but to have the conversation exist on more of a global scale, such that we're now on a panel discussion, being able to ask those questions and provide some of those answers.
Thank you so much. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, the other thing I should say is, and Simca thinks big, and he was the one who initiated and thought about bringing Samuel L. Jackson on, and there's the advantage to that. I mean, there's obvious advantages. Is he's very connected. He was an activist. He happened to actually have, at one time, he was a diver as well, but also, we're not doing a PhD thesis, and we're creating an audiovisual material that we want young people, old people, we want to speak to people. Samuel Jackson helped bring, and he understands that he does that, helps bring a lot of attention and helped us. It helps us also raise the money to be able to do this, because that is just a reality. And you're pitching something that's so big in scope, and you need backers and broadcasters to buy into that vision. And there's no question that having Samuel L. Jackson involved, by the way, which helps with the storytelling too. He's fantastic. But as you saw, there's diving, there's history segments, there's his journey. I mean, there's a lot of interwoven elements to try and make it historically valid, but also engaging, and draw in the youth who should know their history.
Yeah, it is so rich, and it really does that. You tell a shared story and you make it personal, and Samuel Jackson contributes to that, but it's not only about him, right? It's so plural, and I just loved the way you kept going back and forth from the divers, the journalists, F. Hirsch, Herdeman. You drew everyone into the story. One aspect of the story that you draw out, and that I think is a hugely important part of the educational experience, is in episode 2, where you have Simca in an archive, looking at the starting point of racialization, and it could hardly be more poignant for today's session. It's in Toledo, Spain. It's the 1452 purity of blood legislation. It sends chills up the spine, and it's about excluding Jews and Muslims who used to be just forced converted to Catholicism to be included in the polity, but now were no longer able by religious conversion to become a part of the polity, right? They were racialized. And that becomes your starting point. You communicate that in a very powerful way that those tools, racial purity, become a basis for the very rational and sinister transatlantic slave trade. Can you say a little bit more about that racialization and its relationship to transatlantic slavery and why it's so important for us to make those connections?
Kramer?
Okay. I was going to ask if you wanted to start. Yes, right. But then I feel like I have to not challenge the episode or even the topic, but bring up more breadth to the conversation, because the whole idea behind that conversation was the purity of blood.
Yes.
But you can't have a conversation about the purity of blood in the 1400s if you're not going to engage in conversation about what happened 700 years prior to that, right? Which was the Moors coming into Southern Europe, right, and ruling Southern Europe for 700 years.
Yes.
Right. So that scene, right, opens the door to having larger and deeper conversation about the fears of the Europeans and the rejection of Moorish control of Southern Europe for 700 years.
Absolutely. This is the point of expulsion, right? Not the beginning of contact or entry or rule. So this is, and this comes back to your earlier point, doesn't it, Kramer, about the episode as opening deeper, longer, thicker conversations, right? Yeah. And so it's already a shift in the starting point from those who would situate the beginning of racialization in slavery. And then there's so much more. So a pedagogical tool, that's a beginning. Yeah.
Also, I mean, I totally agree. And I think that when initially, I mean, very, very first meetings were, how do you take 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade and just even distill it into anything, right? It now, when you've done it, it's always like this with project. When you've done it, it goes like this, makes total sense. But remember, you start with a really blank page. I don't mean a blank page of history, but a blank page of how you're going to organize that history into. So the idea that Simcha had was just to kind of something, it's not an entire history level. It is exactly that, Kramer, something where we hope it will be used for education to start a discussion. Nothing can be, absolutely definitive. But the fact that it's the blood quantum, that's something that plays out now amongst Indigenous. It's an issue. It's an issue about how people who we are, how people judge each other. So I think he seeing that in writing, seeing that you're literally judged by the purity of your blood was just such a stark, vivid way of expressing profound racism, kind of, endorsed by an institution that was highly respected.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Right.
Go right ahead, please.
During the age supposedly of enlightenment, where race comes in
Yes.
Say, okay, purity sets up the idea of what race is, which is just a social construct.
Right.
That they've created for the purposes of saying we're over here and everybody else is over there, right? So I appreciate what it was that was done, and we can't. If we were to engage in an even broader discussion, then we would be at a point where we were having 32 or some odd episodes. And the purpose was to begin or engage in conversation, right?
And you're both so modest about that, but really, what a beginning, right? Because, I mean, you bring so many elements. You decenter so much as well of the perception of where slavery predominated, and you really communicate by going back and forth in time, across the Atlantic, in South America as well as U.S. and Canada. You capture how deeply global the slave trade was, and how unfinished the work of slavery is, right? And that's why some scholars refer to the afterlives of slavery, because we see it in the conditions. And one of the things that you capture in Suriname, this is a quote, "What you see here, you would have seen 500 years ago. Descendants of enslaved Africans still cutting cane." Right? And so that you convey this cruel rationality. So yes, the Enlightenment period, slavery and the slave trade were scientific, from the way the slave ships were packed, and to minimize resistance, to the production of sugar as a sweetener, enabling coffee and tea markets to flourish. I welcome your thoughts then, knowing that it's a conversation opener on how slavery is currently taught in schools and SEISHEPs and universities, and the contribution of this public history that you've produced to the films to opening discussions about the slave trade, and about how much more we need to know.
Is that me or is that Rick?
It's either. Who would like to start, please?
Go ahead, Kramer. I love listening to you talk.
Well, Rick knows that Kramer talking just kind of happens, right? I'm talking and communicating based off of one, emotionally where I may be at a particular time, right? Because people connect to emotions, right? But emotions have absolutely nothing to do with the facts of what happened or what occurred, right? And I believe we should be focused more on fact than emotion, but you draw people in with the emotion, right? And before we continue with this dialogue, I would be remiss if I did not say again, right, that the vision and the pulling together of the episodes, right, was all in the mind's eye of Rick and Simca and Yaron, right? Structuring it and delivering it in a way that people could connect to and feel emotional about. I had absolutely nothing to do with, right? I was just a cog in a wheel, right? So when I looked at the episodes after they were developed, I was moved, right? And got a better sense of the picture of what it was that they were attempting to put together, right? Because I couldn't see that from the box within which I was operating.
Well, just so the audience hears, basically, I mean, there are, as I said, 3 different components. So Kramer was the lead on all of the dives. the dives were being shot very separately from the other material. So Kramer and the team had an awareness of it. In fact, I was only present in Florida, so I was not in Suriname. And in a way, things come together very, not piecemeal, because there's a plan, but so there was a vision behind it. And I won't take credit for that. I'll take some credit for some stuff, but I won't take credit for that overall vision. And the dive element is hard. It's factual, but a lot of it is hard. I mean, I think that you're following experiences of the divers in real time. And, even when in one of the episodes, they find, in episode 2, they find something at the bottom of the sea. It was a very dangerous dive. And the story of the dive forms part of the episode. But the idea is that the dives are a springboard to tell a larger story. But in and of themselves, they're the heart of the episode, because what are you going to find? What does that boat tell you about the theme of that episode? And so there's a real meshing together. If you ask, where does this sit? It's not definitive, but we always talk about never again. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors too. We talk about never again. But things keep happening. And they're happening now in our world. How many, there was something like, I wrote it down because I got 45,000 ships, 45,000 voyages, taking people from a continent and moving them, just wrenching them from their homes. 45,000, that's a machine. What's that machine that allows human beings to do something like that? If you just, as Canadians, we know not a lot, never enough, but we're familiar with the American slavery story, the civil rights movement, the Jim Crow. We're aware of that here. We're not learning enough of it in our schools, but we're aware. But we're not really, I didn't know about I knew that people came from Africa, but I hadn't really sussed the magnitude of what it means and how many people and how many institutions would be complicit to have something like that. I mean, it's actually, even as I'm talking now, I'm getting emotional, because the magnitude of it just really hit me. And in order it's important, I think, for all of us to understand we're seeing institutions right now on our planet that are fraying and allowing human rights indignities to happen. And so it's important not only to understand that particular history, but to understand the capacity for man's inhumanity to man. I mean, in a way that, and that's what I think drove all of us, that felt that this was an important story to understand. It's the machinery of enslaving people. The fact that they redesigned sails, and the designing of sails was on ships contributed, because it helped the capacity. And so it really moved a lot of the people, including Samuel Jackson and Kramer and his team, and Rhiannon Giddens, who is she's a singer, but she's in one of the episodes. We're having a conversation, but there's a lot of people who haven't seen. We talk about cultures, for example. People talk about African American culture, jazz music, how it contributed. People know that in a kind of in a superficial way, but there was so much that was brought over in the bowels of those slave ships that is integrated into American culture and Brazilian culture that can't be separated anymore, that we don't know about, like the banjo, and Rhiannon Giddens is able to tell that story. So we're only giving one example, but it shows you how integrated that history is in our own history. I'll stop babbling, but that was my little,
Not at all.
Babbling, but just as a check, those 45,000 ships don't equate to 45,000 voyages, because each ship did close to 10 voyages, right? So we're talking close to 500,000 voyages.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the idea of being able to quantify the magnitude, the number of people, we had to have for ourselves today to process the numbers. It's unfathomable, right? And the idea that you're talking about potentially 12 million or more people. There are countries today that don't encompass 12 million people. If you took the entirety of the country of Greece, right, is not 12 million people, but let's say we wiped Greece completely off the face of the planet, right? If you look, if countries are able to look at the numbers in terms of the population of countries, then maybe that would have they would have more context, right? But we're bean counting at this point, because thinking in terms of human beings being enslaved and tortured and raped and killed, right, is something that we can't fathom today, right? And yes, the invention of the sails, right, ended up being a horrific thing for the slave trade, right? But there were ships that were designed specifically for the trade, right? So they had cargo ships, and then they said, no, we're going to make ships today for this purpose. Yeah. Now, consider those were the cutting edge of technology at that time. Look at the cutting edge for technology at this time with cargo ships, and imagine the damage that could have been done. Right?
Yeah, so powerful. And the magnitude is at once unfathomable, but the rationality of it you convey so clearly. This was putting the cutting edge of science at the time to the service of evil for clear economic reasons, right? This was the dominant economic institution. And what you continue to come back to, and I think it's encapsulated actually in one of the frankly breathtakingly disturbing scenes where you show a mini golf field. It looks so peaceful, except you realize that is what was done in this contemporary society to cover up a burial site of enslaved Africans, right? And I want you, I raise that example and then think about so much of the uncovering that your work, that Diving with a Purpose does, and that you capture through this documentary, because you uncover much of the history that's submerged, and in some cases actually covered up, right, rather than commemorated. And I want to think a little bit about what our responsibility is now, for both knowing and reckoning with the past. Kramer,
yes, right. Yeah. I don't think that scene, the golf course, was designed to cover up the burial ground.
Okay.
I think, and this is me, right, just a disrespect and disregard for the humanity of those people who were dropped in a hole there.
Yeah. Is that better?
No, right? It's
right.
worse, right?
Indeed. Indeed.
Our global inhumanity still today. Right? You can look to the past and say, well, this was the thinking of of white supremacy at that time, right? And we are reckoning with and attempting to come to terms with that thinking or what took place then. But when you look at what happened today or what is happening today, right, and they're still acting in the same way, a disregard for human beings.
Yeah.
We really haven't moved.
Yeah.
But then we're looking for change within ourselves and how it is that we address what it is that took place, and not really looking at how that occurred. What was the mindset of the people that did that thing, right? And whether or not that mindset still remains today, and I contend that it does. Right? And educating people is not going to do anything about the hatred that exists in the hearts and minds of others who would engage in that kind of activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And its character as a global institution. We have a question from the audience, and I'm inclined to introduce this into the discussion because I think it very much teases out an aspect of your work. And it was whether the documentary addresses the cultural, social, economic, and political disruption that occurred in the African continent due to the transatlantic slave trade. So request a comment on that.
That's a really good question. I'll tell you, we don't really tackle that, but one of the things that surprised me when I went to Gabon and to Ghana and spoke to academics and academics from various countries in Africa was that the people of Africa themselves, I mean, because they weren't enslaved and it was generations ago, they so often knew, I mean, Ghana knows a lot more, but they knew so little about that history. In fact, in Gabon, which is, we went to Gabon for those who again haven't seen it, because Samuel Jackson did a DNA test, and the DNA traced him to the Benga tribe. And the king of the Benga currently lives in Gabon, which is why we ended up in that country. And we were looking for a historian to talk about the history of the Benga, the history of slavery in that country. And it was actually difficult to find. We found a fantastic historian, but everyone pointed to one person who knew. So I'm sure there is an impact, and that is a subject that's worth exploring. But we found that there was no, the people who live there now didn't really think about the slave trade. We do touch on the fact that there was slavery within Africa, but it's very different. It was very different. Wasn't people treated as chattel? And we touch on it briefly in the series because it would be remiss not to touch on it, but we didn't dwell on that aspect of slavery.
Kramer, do you have a comment in relation to that? It's also the engagement with the Ashanti, and including their own apology, I think was really very powerfully done. So we have only a few minutes left. Let me ask you a question, since this is a Canadian co-production, and one of the dynamics you underscore in the absolutely pivotal episode on resistance is the role of what is referred to as the Underground Railroad. And of course, so much about Canada's self-concept is framed around being a place that received those fleeing from slavery, and you chronicle the freedom boats as a powerful example of this. And this is, of course, important, but we also face a situation where many in Canada have not reckoned with the fact that slavery existed in Canada too. And that much of that history needs to be told in a fulsome manner. It's something also that's explored increasingly in some of the important fictional work. Lawrence Hill, Essie Adukian are two contemporary examples. So maybe I'll ask if there's another episode or another production underway. More seriously, directions that you would like to see Enslaved propel others to take.
Well, I would agree with you that I think it's a very important topic for the Canadian story, because Canadians do not know the Canadian story, and I include myself, in that. Now I know obviously more because you end up researching. But the series Enslaved really didn't focus on that, because for Harriet Tubman, Canada was the promised land at the time. So, we just didn't deal with that. We were kind of dealing with the resistance. We were trying to talk about resistance, and this was such an important resistance story. I mean, she's an iconic woman. The Underground Railroad was known because for those people who came here, they wanted to leave America. But I think there should be another. Well, we should talk about that. Because I think it is a part of our history that should be told. And I'm not sure if there have been documentaries on that, but I totally agree with you.
I think what the purpose has been for the past 16 years as a volunteer organization, right, trying to bring these stories to light. There, I believe, I'm going to approximate, right, that there are approximately 5 ships associated with the transatlantic slave trade that have been documented thoroughly, right? Out of some estimates say between 500 and 1,000 ships that wrecked that didn't make it. So the area of discovery is vast, right? And we are always looking to engage, to be able to tell the story, right? So that we can learn more about our past, such that it informs where we are today.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to leave it there and have Rick and others consider the idea of additional episodes, since we have literally 1,000 ships that still need to be discovered.
I will say we have, correct me if I'm wrong, Kramer, we did the most dives of slave ships ever that have ever been done. And diving it's complicated. It's complicated. It's dangerous. It's there's a lot of things. I mean, and I hope people will watch. You can see it on CBC in Canada for free. It's a streamer. It's also episode 4 is airing on CBC this Sunday night, and then subsequent episodes. But you can always catch up on GEM, and I think. It would be amazing, Kramer, if we could do that, because what we learned, for example, Suriname, I love all the episodes, but I love that episode. The Suriname is not, Kramer had the courage to go into the water, but the story, it's a story of a boat, but every dive in the episode has its own personality. Yes. So Suriname, the water was very murky, but there was an incredible story to be told, and it was a very obscure story. It was right out of a PhD from a Dutch man, Leo Belay, who's amazing, and he was obsessed with this boat, the Lousden, in a very positive way, and we were able to piggyback on his knowledge and bring him and tell this story, a story that otherwise just would sit in some obscure library in the Netherlands. Yeah. And the diving the English Channel allowed us to tell another story. And one of the interesting things about the Underground Railroad story was it was a boat that was in Sweetwater in a lake, which meant that it wasn't destroyed. Often when Kramer is diving, they come up with an anchor or a cannonball or an artifact. But
an elephant tusk. Yeah.
I mean, that would be amazing because
Yeah.
there are so many stories to be told, and it's such an engaging way. I mean, it sounds a little bit crass because it's such an important and serious topic, but if you're doing things for television, you want to draw people in. And I will say that it aired on the BBC in the UK, and we brought in not we, I mean, it's BBC too, but they had such a young audience viewing it. They were so thrilled because it's very hard to bring in that young audience. But as people involved, and Kramer, you'll appreciate this, when you get young people to watch something like this, I can't describe the satisfaction because it will pique some of their curiosity. It will make them read more. Not all of them, but
no, but it will. There is so
hopefully will make people want to explore a little more. I mean, it's little. So I don't know. Let's go for it, Kramer.
I can.
Right, and discovering their history and teaching them critical thinking, I'm always in favor of.
Yeah. There is so much left to be said. I knew this would be a hard conversation because there is so much to say, such richness, but you have opened up conversations that we just must have. We must keep having them. And you've offered a brilliant new way to have them. I cannot thank you enough. This has been a great conversation. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Marlene and your team for organizing such a fantastic dimension of this day. And thank you again, Beryl, for your role.
Thanks so much.